Good evening, everyone. I would like to call the March 6th meeting of the Finance Committee to order. Please call the roll.
Councilor King.
Present.
Councilor DeBona.
Present.
Councilor Finn.
Present.
Councilor Harris.
Present.
Councilor Hughes. Councilor LaFars. Councilor Mann. Present. Councilor Calhoun. Councilor Cole.
Present.
7
We indeed have a quorum, and I did, just for the record, get a couple phone calls and text messages from folks running late. We start this evening at 6 p.m., which is obviously challenging for folks coming from their day jobs, so I appreciate those that were able to get here and make it happen. So before we get into the curriculum for this evening, here's the open meeting law, and it reads as follows. Pursuant to the open meeting law, any person may make an audio or video recording of this public meeting or may transmit this meeting during the meeting. Attendees are therefore advised that such recordings or transmissions are being made, whether perceived or unperceived, by those present and are deemed acknowledged and permissible. So before us this evening, councilors and committee, we have two items. The first of which is Councilor 2017-003, which is the adoption of the municipal finance policy and procedures. We're joined here this evening by the Director of Finance of the city and his staff, Mark Kavanaugh, who I believe is going to walk us through several slides, and then what we'll do is we'll open it up for some Q&A. Sound good? Welcome, Mark.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The financial policy presentation that I'll go through this evening is an updated version from the presentation that you heard last June. And the reason for the update is when I made the presentation last June and went through all the financial policies, I neglected to attach a formal council order. So when you took the recommendations for the financial policies into the Finance Committee, you didn't have a vehicle with it to come out of it with and to vote. So we've corrected that oversight. We now have a formal council order attached should you hopefully see fit to endorse and adopt policies for the city. The numbers have been updated for this presentation tonight. Not that many of them. We have the audited financial statements as of June 30th, 2016. We worked with an unaudited finalized copy for purposes of going through the review of the financial statements with the rating agencies. Just as a brief review of what we went through in June, all government entities utilize various credit instruments for debt. They issue bonds, bands, which are bond anticipation notes, GANs, grant anticipation notes, and notes such as treasury notes at the federal level. Now, the debt's spread out. It spreads out the financing and capital assets, with the goal being to spread the cost out over the life of the asset. So we have everything that we ask you folks to vote on, from schools and public buildings going to 30 or 40 years, ladder trucks 20 years, heavy equipment 15 years, down to police cars and computers often at only the 5-year point. That's usually the cutoff. But the general goal is to finance assets over the useful life. Now, the financial policies are statements of guidelines and goals that will inform and guide financial management and practices of the city. These are based on the best practices of municipalities around Massachusetts. They come to us as recommendations from our bankers, from our independent accountants, and our bond counsel. To promote long-term financial stability. And by long-term, I mean beyond this administration. It's a long-term view that we take. We hope that these policies would be helpful to the city of Quincy for generations. They provide a framework for measuring the fiscal impact of government services against established benchmarks around the state. The players, people involved in who sets the rating and who gets involved in advising us on what's best for our financial policies are first and foremost the rating agencies. They analyze the financial statements and the performance of the municipalities who wish to issue the debt. They conduct rating calls with the administration. And anytime we're going to the market, we know we're going to have a rating call with our agency. And it can be lengthy. It's usually about an hour, hour and a half, and we'll have about 10 to 12 people on the phone. We'll have the mayor, we'll have obviously the chief of staff, we'll have legal counsel involved, we'll have the bankers involved, and we also utilize our outside accounting firm when necessary. Usually a couple of people from the rating agency as well. The credit rating report, the recommendations of the final product, usually there's 10 different levels of scoring. And if you look up at the chart, you'll see it goes from AAA all the way down to D, which is junk bond. Quincy is right above, right in between AA and AAA, or AA plus are at about 9 out of 10 as far as a high ranking. So we're doing very well. On the calls, we'll discuss union contracts, city development projects, housing values, vacancy stats, unemployment figures, commercial taxpayer subsidization, stabilization, OPEB funding, CIP plans, and the policies that are before you tonight. After the call, it usually takes about 7 to 10 days for the credit rating report to be issued. And using this scale, Quincy's been doing very well, and we were recently upgraded to AA plus stable. The ratings that were given after these calls gives the independent investors a good insight into the valuation of the city's bonds, and it allows the city to get a lower interest rate than the riskier ratings would allow for a lower ranked city. Also within the framework of the credit rating, the reporting agency makes recommendations to the city on how to maintain or improve the status of the rating that they've been given. All of our recent reports, and I'm going back to 2015 or so, have indicated that we need to move forward with the financial policies that are in front of you tonight, as well as to issue forecasts, which we did for the first time last spring. This was a solid path to upgrading and keeping our high credit rating. The specific recommendations that have been made to you have already been discussed, as I said earlier, with the rating agencies. They've been vetted by our investment bankers and reviewed by Powers & Sullivan, our outside accounting firm. Additionally, I need to point out to you, since we've been issued the most recent credit rating report, which came out in January, the Standard & Poor's specifically said we could lower the rating if the city failed to formally adopt the recently introduced policies. And as a factor of an upside scenario, the carrot, we could raise the rating if the city demonstrates strict adherence to the financial policies and the practices that we hope that they adopt. Getting into the specific policies and goals, the stabilization fund, we've come a long way in Quincy since 2009. At one point when we looked, stabilization had fallen in the second year of the recession to about $900,000. You see that at the far left of the screen. Through your help, through your endorsement of allowing us to put free cash aside on an almost annual basis, we've risen that up to a level of $10.3 million. For the purpose of calculating our reserve levels, which the rating agencies for a city up of our rating and our size say should be between 5 and 6%. They also allow us to calculate in free cash. So you see the green portion of the chart is the free cash we were able to add into the reserve level and be counted in a positive way for the city as of June 30th, 2016. For the first time in quite some time, I'm not even sure if we had ever hit it before, our target level of between 14 and 16 million was hit. We were at 15.4 or 15.5 million, I forget exactly. And we were rewarded at that point with a stable outlook from Moody's, as well as encouraged to keep going. They'd like to see us add to that stabilization and reserve fund. The primary reason that they want to see the city's stabilization and reserve funds increase is to weather any bad storms, to weather the ups and downs, not just the inclement weather we've experienced in recent years, but economical downturns, recessions. It could serve as a replacement for lost income. Formally, the policies that we're asking you to adopt, one would be a policy to set aside at least 20% of annual free cash for the purpose of stabilization. That would be one policy. It doesn't limit us. We could set aside more. It's a minimum of 20%. We also have a adopted policy proposed to you for 20% of free cash to go to the OPEB trust fund. We currently have a little over $1 million there. It is a significant long-term 40-year obligation. We need to do a better job. It specifically told us to begin to address this more aggressively. This would be a step towards that. A third step would be 10% of free cash going to the inclement weather fund. This is an additional hedge to the appropriations that you people have voted for each year to increase our snow and ice budget. We've gone from $300,000 in snow and ice in the mid-2000s up to what will be over $2.2 million that's proposed to you in May when we add another $150,000 to the $2.16 currently. And the weather's not getting that much easier, weather fighting, I think. So an additional hedge to go along with our annual appropriation would be appreciated and was welcomed by the rating agencies. The fourth and final grouping is debt service, and it's combined with a capital improvement plan, because last year we were rolling out to you the first of a 5-year rolling plan. So they took that into consideration. They were huge supporters of that so that they know what type of large spending is coming year to year. At least roughly know what the city's thinking. They're more reassured by the fact that we continue to have a 5-year outlook from this year forward. So if there's a particular group of things, school buses or whatever the need might be, if we don't do it in year one, we've discussed it and we have it on the agenda for year two. And we keep rolling that forward. That was important. Very important policy they'd like us to formally adopt is to maintain total outstanding debt of the city below the range of, or within the range of 6 to 7.5% of the current year's operating budget. We're well within that. Currently, we're at 5.6 of the operating budget, so we could take on more, but it's a healthy ratio. And again, these are benchmark numbers that are utilized by the top-rated cities and towns in the Commonwealth. In addition, outstanding debt levels should not exceed 2.5% of total assessed valuation, which is $13 billion in the city of Quincy. That's a ratio that the bankers favor. DOR is a bigger fan of the debt-to-budget ratio, so we've included both of them at your suggestion. The 5-year rolling capital improvement plan, they were big fans of, and we're already, we've done that for 1 year. This year will be our second year when we come to you later in the spring. There's also a 5% minimum dedicated debt service to CIP. This has been adopted recently by many cities to show a continued commitment, even if there is an administrative change at the executive level, that there'll be a floor, there'll be a base ceiling that the city would have adopted to recognize the investment that's necessary to keep the city's capital assets in top shape and not let it slide for any particular reason so that we get ourselves in hole and have to overspend in the future. That's the summary. I'd just like to emphasize that, I don't know if pressure is the right word. Yeah, it's always pressure. They spelled out pretty specifically a downside scenario if we don't adopt formal fiscal financial policies to guide us. They spelled out a pretty good upside if we were to adopt them and strictly adhere to them. So they've given us a blueprint. All of our best people and advisors have weighed in. They've reviewed these. They've participated in constructing them. I had a first draft of these written in 2000. 2015, and here we are in 2017. Finally, a vehicle to go before you and get a vote. Open it up to questions, Jim.
So thank you very much, Mr. Kavanaugh. As I say a lot, because I know a lot goes into it, I certainly appreciate the professionalism of both yourself and the department. Transition, I guess, in the sequence of questions, I just want to kind of touch base with folks, because my takeaway from last meeting essentially was I wanted to make a point to connect with the outside auditor of Powers and Sullivan. And I'm only saying this because I have you here now, but to explore that idea about the excess revenue inside of the DIF account and what that may or may not mean in terms of keeping it inside of the DIF account versus leaving it as a sinking fund inside of the general account. Ms. O'Connor was kind enough to be on the call with me, so I don't know if you want to just remind me, just take a 30-second kind of paraphrase of what went on and what kind of Mr. Powers' thoughts were. And I only say that because it's important. This will connect into the discussion this evening, particularly as we form our attitude towards stabilization. So thank you.
Thank you. As Councilor Crowell stated, we did have a conference call last Friday, I believe, with Jim Powers from Powers and Sullivan, and what was discussed was the resolution that had come before the council, I believe, at the last meeting. In that discussion, Mr. Powers stated that it definitely could be done, however, it is a policy decision. It was certainly allowable. He stated that it would require a vote by the city council. And if there was money that was captured and left in the sinking fund, it would have to remain in the sinking fund. You could not take it out at any time. It could only remain in the sinking fund and be used for the DIF district. He said without a policy, any excess revenues go back to the general fund, which is currently what is happening now. He did also say that the DIF stabilization fund, if the money was put into a segregated fund, the sinking fund, that does affect all taxpayers.
So thank you very much. And he also did say that, again, it's a conversation that will take place. He did agree to come to the chambers and be part of the discussion. But I think Madam Auditor laid it out quite nicely. Is obviously it'll be a policy decision, but any excess surplus revenue that's generated from the downtown, that if we were to pivot and go in a new direction and keep it in a sub-account, for lack of a better word, inside of the DIF, those monies would be taken into account by the auditors, by the credit analysts when they start to shape their perception on our overall target for stabilization. So I thought that was a pretty good thing to come out of that conversation that I was unaware of going into it. But, like I said, I know the focus of the meeting is not on that, whereas that was part of last meeting's discussion. I just wanted to kind of update the council that to be continued, and we'll invite Mr. Powers and obviously Mr. Kavanaugh to kind of talk through that to see if it is a direction that we want to explore.
The only thing I would add that from the Loud Council,
Of course.
That things are tight. We don't have a lot of excess money. So part of the things that these policies before you tonight to vote on, taking 50% of free cash for the various needs I spelled out, are for that specific purpose, to make sure that we have formally adopted public policies, so we're adding to those funds. Frankly, because things are tight, because the revenue's tight, as you know, as you debate the budget each spring, and Councilor Finn's pointed out many, many times, the votes that are taken then are going to directly affect what that tax rate is. And if money were to be diverted away from the DIF, other than just paying the debt, which is all it's set up for now, it would affect the tax rate. Because all the money was used. Anything not raised by in the tax rate pool would go to increase property taxes.
Correct, but you also don't base your policy decisions or your budgetary conversations around anticipated free cash flow. You
No, we don't.
So
Right
basically-
now, we're counting on all of the DIF money, other than what's earmarked specifically for debt service,
Correct.
which we know a year ahead of time, is for the general fund.
So you are using that, I think RKG put out, I don't know, if it was 1.2 or 1.7 in excess revenue. You are using that to build up your budget?
Yeah, we're counting that up in the general fund. Anything other than what's needed for debt service. So as the auditor stated, it would be a policy decision to take money away from what's currently going to the general fund, which is tax money.
Correct.
Otherwise have to be made up by property tax increases. If it's segregated to the DIF and kept in the DIF, can only be used for the DIF, it can't be used for the general fund, which can only be supported by additional tax.
Correct. And there's
But
been-
that is, it's a policy decision.
I think it's a conversation worth having, in my own opinion, whether or not we decide to move forward or remain as it is.
Sure.
You know, the DIF district has always been set up to be fully self-supporting, and
Yes.
essentially its own entity.
From the get-go to be self-supporting, and right now, the only stated expenses that it's obligated to cover is the debt service.
expenditures.
And the large projects, as we sort of touched on there in the policies, you finance over time, unless you do the borrowing for the pans and then the long-term financing for street works and sidewalks and things like that.
And just to kind of give folks I'll continue on that, I appreciate you weighing in on it, just to give folks a snapshot, because I wasn't aware of it either. It was something I reached out to the auditor right before the day's end. I just was curious, like the last 3 years of free cash, right, like what that looked like monetarily. 2015, we were roughly at 9.7, 2016 was about 7 million, and this past year was 4.8. So you're looking at 2010-20, right, which accumulates 50% of that already being earmarked before we
I
even
trust
have
the
it.
auditor to say this.
Right. So I just kind of want to put that out to folks to sort of frame the discussion and give you some historical perspective as to what is and has already taken place. So I don't want to strong on this entire conversation, so before I kind of continue, I'll open it up and see if folks have questions, comments, Council Finn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also thank you, Mr. Kavanaugh. And thank you for getting some of this stuff to us in kind of a timely fashion before the meeting this evening. And also thank you to the chairman who seems to facilitate a lot of that to us, so thank you. I guess I'm trying to understand this, particularly as it relates to free cash, is that, again, free cash is certified by the Department of Revenue. Is it at that particular point that these percentages then would be distributed to these various accounts?
Yes, that's my understanding,
That's-
Counselor, that it would be upon recertification, whether that's once or you're actually allowed 2 a year. You can get your original certification, and you can go back for recertification once more if you've collected additional revenue during the year. You want to have DOR certified another amount. So every time they're certified, in my mind, that's when the policy is going to place.
So it wouldn't be, and this is, forgive me, but I'm trying to think like a mayor here, that we're not talking about free cash broken out into percentages after, a certain amount of free cash is being used for other projects or other things at this point. We're really
It would
talking
be
about,
50%.
at certification, we're talking about that free cash going specifically to these accounts.
Correct.
The only other thing that I would admit, and I think Councilor Crowell's, or Chairman Crowell's, is really a discussion worth having if we go further down, I think, beyond these policies, because it does strike me that it provides, in a certain sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Chairman, but, one of the things we've been hearing, if these projections don't work out, so to speak, that it gives some cushion in the diff as it relates to not hitting the tax increases later on and putting that on to the budget, so to speak. So but I understand also the dilemma that you're pointing to. I guess the one thing that's confusing to me is I get when it comes to the idea of controlling the level of debt, and that we're at 5.8 now, which is really helpful from my understanding. That's a great thing. And I get that, and I think that that's, as a policy of keeping our budget within that is important. But I have to admit, the idea of, again, developing a policy that says that you have to carry a minimum of debt, I'm not certain, I mean, that doesn't strike me as a great policy necessarily. In fact, it seems to me to be a formula for spending. And in certain respects, particularly because we're talking about the operating budget, it really kind of handcuffs this body in terms of trying to control the tax rate. Because, again, you're going to be projecting out. I mean, we've always looked at debt service in terms of the budget, that for it to be realistic and based on need, based on what we've actually financed and the like. But to include this minimum, who's promoting that as a great practice, I guess?
It's a relatively new financial policy. It's been adopted by some AAA communities who see it as a way of ensuring going forward, when administrations do change, that there would be a certain level of commitment to looking at whatever the city's oldest, weakest assets are, to put it another way, to be on the lookout for what needs replacement. These are parameters. They're benchmarks used by other cities. I don't think there's any rating agency that would fault the city for falling below the 5%. I think you get points for having the 5% in there.
Well, I mean, where I'm confused by this, Mr. Kavanaugh, is even if we adopt this as a policy, it's going to take us quite a while to be putting less than 5% into any budget, right? Correct?
I agree.
So why have this policy? It seems to me to kind of, hamstring future city councils and their ability to be able to determine what that budget is and to cut from that budget where necessary. I think we've had a fairly responsible approach. I'm pushing back here. I don't know when any mayor's approached here and really turned away in terms of a specific bond issue per se. So I'm really I have to admit, I'm just kind of confused by that one piece.
I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah.
As much as I know about it, it's a floor to not let cities go too far below, to not ignore the capital asset investments.
Well, I guess then, what's our role in this? Are we voting to adopt these policies
Yes, it's in
ourselves?
front of you as a formal council order to adopt the policy. I'm not saying you can't strike one and say you had a problem with it.
Well, my own feeling is I would like to strike that specifically myself, but again, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
So, just to kind of keep it moving around the thought, stabilization, right? So the current financial policy as presented to us basically suggests a minimum level of 5 to 6% reserves of audited general fund revenue of the previous fiscal year. I agree with Council Finn in terms of we have a lot going on. And, I practice the same principles in my house. I like to, I'm sure it sounds safer, right? So, whereas there's a lot of activity going on in the city. I mean, I'm a pro of anything that we can do, to continue to save and increase our rainy day fund, particularly at this juncture in the city. It sits well with me. So I also had a conversation with the credit analyst, just because I wanted to learn and understand a little bit more as well. And you're absolutely right. She did say specifically that it is, from a credit analyst standpoint, in the city's best interest to adopt financial policies, because it makes things able to be determined from a rating perspective. So I could see what you're saying in terms of we have a commitment to